In the December 2017 system guide, we discovered the unexpected. Given the bevy of pre-built computing devices now available, there's a lot of debate and confusion about building one yourself these days. What's the goal behind a custom PC build in 2018? What makes a certain hardware choice right to support that? So rather than starting 2018 with a traditional guide, where Ars presents 3 build ideas and a set of specific hardware to accomplish each, we are going to take a step back. This will be more of a meta-guide than an actual guide. We are going to share the methods and mechanics behind putting together your favorite long-running PC building guide. So, while this guide will build from a set of 3 major system design goals like always, this edition will go through each major PC hardware component one by one, focusing more on ideology than instruction, discussing how a specific part does, or doesn't, contribute to a specific construction goal. Standard system design goals. It's not enough to say a system should be fast, just like it's not enough to sum up a sports car with its 0 to 60 time on a track. A gaming-focused system that impressively renders the most demanding scenes in Crisis can still be frustratingly slow to boot, and may handle the same gaming scenes abysmally if you forgot to, or didn't want to, close your email client or your 30-tab web browser first. A system with server intentions may effortlessly run 5 or 10 entire virtual machines but similarly stumble on a single demanding application. Meanwhile, a 5-year-old system that doesn't have very impressive specs might feel surprisingly fast. You know you're not going to play the latest AAA games in 4K on it, and you don't expect it to handle 200 tabs in Chrome, but somehow, despite how old it is, such a build can feel comfortable. Generally speaking, the 3 machines described above are typical of 3 high-level system characteristics we'll be outlining: general performance, multitasking, and frames per second, or FPS for short. General performance. This category may be the most ambiguous, therefore it's the most contentious when determining which parts make sense. When we talk about general performance in the scope of the system guide, we are not talking about crushing any individual benchmark with super high numbers. What we are actually talking about is bottleneck elimination. A system with high general performance doesn't feel sluggish, even if it doesn't have the biggest, beefiest parts, because its performance is as consistent as possible. When you double-click an icon on the desktop, you have an expectation of how long it will take to open the application or document. A machine with high general performance reliably satisfies that expectation. A machine more heavily focused on application-specific performance might frequently fail. General performance machines likely work for the largest amount of common use cases. It's entirely possible to build a machine that gets really great frame rates in all your games, but such a machine can be massively frustrating because it takes 3 or 4 times longer to start an app, including a game, than others. At the same time, an older general performance machine that benchmarks out slower may feel better if it pushes 2/3 of the general frame rate, but doesn't have those irritating, immersion-breaking lurches once or twice in a 15-minute session of play. This isn't just a gaming thing, either. The same is true of machines that usually open Office documents in 300 milliseconds but occasionally take 1,500 milliseconds for no immediately obvious reason, or machines that take 500 milliseconds to open the same document but take that 500 milliseconds every time. An ideal general performance machine has as much to do with human psychology as it does with actual hardware. I've always been fond of a psychology study I read in the 90s, which I've sadly been unable to find again, that outlines something called a 33% expectation threshold. As I recall it, most people won't notice a change in how long it takes a task to complete if it changes by less than a third in either direction. It doesn't really matter how long you expect a task to take in the first place. A 1-second task seems a little quicker than usual, at 667 milliseconds, and slower than usual, at 1,333 milliseconds. A 1-hour task doesn't start seeming slow until 80 minutes, and without measuring it deliberately, it won't really seem fast if it's not done in 40 minutes. This 33% approach has become a great rule of thumb for me when approaching performance over the years. My other favorite rule of thumb is that people remember unpleasant surprises far longer and more vividly than they remember pleasant ones. If you give someone an unexpected win in one hand and an unexpected loss in the other, they will more than likely complain about how much better things used to be. So if you build someone an expensive gaming machine that feels slow and clunky sometimes, they generally won't speak kindly of the experience, either. Multitasking, like general performance, is more important than it might first appear. It's obvious that a system expected to run a few virtual machines will need to multitask well. Ditto for a graphics workstation where you might want Blender and Photoshop open and running simultaneously. However, the ability to handle lots of tasks at once is relevant for any modern general-purpose computer. The operating system itself places frequent multitasking demands on a system, and modern users do, too, more than we realize. If you want to be able to keep your email client up and running all the time so you'll get notifications when that thing from your boss message about your date tonight arrives as you play your game, well, that's multitasking. That email client isn't free in terms of system resources. Want to keep a game wiki up in your browser for reference while you play? Again, multitasking. There is a lot of overlap between multitasking and general performance. You're unlikely to have a machine that exhibits good, consistent performance without several good multitasking characteristics. But it's worth considering these characteristics separately, just as it's worth breaking FPS out next, because you can and may want to take multitasking out to extremes that no longer really affect general performance. Such situations might include VM servers or battle stations that you want to both host and play games on, for instance. On large, we once went ahead and built a gaming-focused system guide rig. FPS was on the mind. FPS thus far we've defined what a category is, but let's discuss what FPS is not. When you're chasing FPS, you're looking for a high overall number of rendered frames per second in games. This does not cover how long it takes to load the game, how long it takes to zone in massive landscape games found in WoW, or even how frequently you have irritating 50 to 500 milliseconds lurches where your frame rate stumbles for just long enough to break immersion. FPS is only about how many frames per second you can expect to render in a given scene of a given game when everything is working right. Editor's note: if you think it sounds like I don't think as highly of FPS as I do of the other characteristics, I won't argue with you. FPS is important. Most gamers will want base frame rates above 60 FPS in even the most demanding scenes of a game. With that said, I will caution anyone who'll listen that there is a big difference between being unhappy with the way a game looks and plays and being unhappy about the number in the FPS counter you've chosen to keep in one corner of the screen. If you want game immersion, you're usually better off killing the FPS counter and addressing the things that make the game occasionally immersion-breakingly slow. Obsessing about whether an icon says 130 FPS, 110 FPS, or 90 FPS while a game is running fine does nothing. Page 2. Now that we've talked about highest level design goals for a system, let's talk about the individual parts you'll need to get there. These are the basic pieces of the puzzle for any build, in no particular order: CPU, GPU, RAM, storage, motherboard, power supply, and chassis. We're not going to recommend any specific parts. Our hardware. CPU. Most people consider the processor the most central part of a system build. Which brand you choose, and which model, will shape your choices for the rest of the system. Your motherboard will need to be the same socket design and have explicit support for the CPU, which then influences your selections of literally every other part in the system. CPUs used to be, and, too often, still are, judged by their clock frequency, measured in MHz or GHz. This is, unfortunately, a pretty useless measure. The internal architecture of the CPU, including but not limited to the amounts of L1 and L2 cache, implementation of the x86 instruction set, number of threads, and more, absolutely overwhelms the raw clock speed in terms of impact on actual performance. Currently, the two most useful measures of CPU performance are multi-threaded pass mark score and single-threaded pass mark score. Both of those scale relatively linearly with the ability of the CPU to actually do the things we want it to do. If you're not sure what a thread is, it's what most people really mean when they talk about how many cores a CPU has. In short, it's how many tasks the CPU can work on simultaneously without needing to time-share a single thread between multiple processes. Modern operating systems make it look like you can run any number of processes simultaneously on a single CPU thread, but in reality, doing so means rapidly swapping processes out every few nanoseconds or milliseconds. Having multiple CPU threads available allows you to both complete those multiple processes simultaneously and avoid performing the relatively expensive context-switching operations necessary to do so. CPU threads are different from CPU cores because the former describes the CPU's ability to carry out tasks simultaneously, while the latter describes physical architecture of the CPU. Remember, those are not always the same thing, since hyper-threading, symmetric multi-threading, warning, that rabbit hole runs deep, can enable a single core to run multiple threads more efficiently. Most games have trouble using more than one or two threads of a CPU, which makes the CPU's single-threaded performance much more relevant to FPS than its multi-threaded performance. For the most part, this holds true in regard to general performance. You're typically better off with 2 really fast CPU threads than 8 mediocre ones. That said, the extra threads aren't a complete waste. Having 8 threads rather than 4 means avoiding performance hits when you keep your email client and multi-tab browser open while your game is running on the other monitor. A machine running several VMs will gobble up all the threads you can feed it. The CPU in a system is most important to multitasking, but it's crucial to all 3 of our design goals. Choose wisely. Goal impact, general performance, multitasking, FPS, a tale of 2 graphics cards, GPUs. Here's the NVIDIA GTX 1070 Ti from fall 2017. Here's the NVIDIA GTX 1080 Ti from spring 2017. GPU. The GPU, graphics processing unit, or graphics card, is the single most crucial part of an FPS-focused build. If you want to do high-resolution gaming, your system will bottleneck on the GPU far more often than it does on the CPU. Meanwhile, games that don't need a heavy-hitter GPU typically don't require much CPU power, either. Having a big, beefy graphics card means higher frame rates in the most demanding parts of your games. It also means being able to consider turning on more of the eye-candy features and running at higher resolutions. In some cases, in fact, not having a relatively recent dedicated GPU may mean not being able to play the game at all. FPS is the only one of our 3 design goals that the GPU particularly impacts, though. While some modern operating system interfaces do take advantage of hardware graphics acceleration, they're not at all demanding and can be serviced just fine even by onboard GPU capabilities of modern CPUs like the Intel Core series or AMD's APU series. And while a hulking big GPU makes high frame rates at high resolutions with lots of effects possible, it won't keep you from getting sidelined by the occasional rendering latency spike due to CPU bottlenecks. Even worse, a giant GPU doesn't guarantee you'll avoid storage bottlenecks, such as when you're waiting for a new zone to load in an MMORPG. A really big GPU also requires some extra planning in your system build. The $500 and above cards generally require more space, consume more power, and generate more heat than a typical desktop system can handle. This upper price range can also generate a ton of noise if you haven't planned out a better way to deal with that extra heat and the fans go into hairdryer mode to keep the card from overheating. You can measure a GPU's performance by its GPU benchmark score to get some idea of how it relates to other video cards, but there's no easy way to translate from GPU benchmarks to how many frames per second you'll see in any particular game. For that, you're likely stuck with the time-tested method of reading the newest forum posts and web pages devoted to timeless internet flexing by way of an FPS counter. Goal impact, base performance, multitasking, FPS, RAM. The RAM is one of the most widely misunderstood basic parts of a system. You can truthfully claim both more RAM won't make that program go faster, and without enough RAM, that program's going to go a lot slower. Here's the deal, you hopefully already know that RAM, your system's memory, is a couple orders of magnitude faster than even the speediest solid-state drive. And you probably already know that if you don't have enough RAM to hold your programs, they can't actually run. The missing factor here is cache. Remember that RAM is a couple orders of magnitude, 100x or more, faster than even the speediest solid-state disk, let alone slow conventional rust disks. Operating system architects have known that for a long time, and OS kernels and/or file systems will therefore gobble up any extra RAM. After all, programs have been loaded into memory as a fast and ready place to stash data that has already been read from disk. That way, if some program wants the same data that another program recently read from, or wrote to, disk, we can avoid the performance hit of having to retrieve that data from disk in the first place. The more RAM you have available, the more fast cache you can keep and the less you have to light up your actual disk. Just as importantly, when you do still have to light up the disk, such as for new writes, any reads you've serviced from cache mean much less competition for the disk's resources. Therefore, those uncacheable writes can get finished more quickly. Not all RAM runs at the same speed, whether we're talking about simple clock speed or about the number of data channels available. You should absolutely take advantage of the fastest RAM your CPU architecture supports, and, if you can, make sure you have enough separate physical DIMMs, dual inline memory module, to feed all the available channels. Any modern CPU supports at least dual-channel memory, while higher-end parts like Intel's i7 or AMD's Threadripper support quad-channel. AMD's EPYC even supports octo-channel. That said, these memory speed differences tend to be fairly minimal in real-world usage. Don't get too obsessive about how fast your RAM is, when you could, and should, instead be obsessing over how much of it you can afford to cram into your build. It's also super important for general performance, given the difference between loading data from disk and loading it from cache in RAM is so enormous. However, RAM is not terribly important for FPS. Generally, either you've got enough RAM to run your game or you don't. Remember that high FPS doesn't mean never having a spike in latency due to unexpected waiting for disk access. If you want an immersive experience with no occasional lurches, you'll need plenty of RAM. Goal impact, base performance, multitasking, FPS, page 3 enlarge, Samsung's 970 Pro and Evo SSDs. Storage is really just a fancy word for what most people refer to as the disk drive. It's also probably the most frequently overlooked and ignored component, which is why OEM vendors still supply laptops with hideous 5,400 revolutions per minute latency monsters when solid-state drives are hundreds of times faster for most tasks, not to mention they're commodity-level cheap. If you start to take your storage seriously and look for comparisons of one disk to another, the first thing you'll usually see is a throughput chart. This disk gets 124 megabytes sec, that one gets 180 megabytes sec, and this one over here gets 300 megabytes sec. Unfortunately, these simple throughput measurements are almost entirely useless. They measure the ability of the drive to read data under completely optimal conditions. When the data is written completely sequentially, is being read sequentially, there's no fragmentation, and only a single process is accessing the disk for a fairly long period of time. That's not how disks are actually used in the real world. Most frequently, anywhere from 3 to 10 processes are all trying to get data at once, and the data is fragmented in the on-disk layout to begin with. For conventional rust disks, this means needing to seek the physical drive head back and forth across the disk like changing tracks on an old vinyl record player, which can and will very quickly change that 180 megabytes sec of throughput down to 1 megabyte sec. Solid-state disks fare much better with this kind of parallel and fragmented data access. An SSD rated for 300 megabytes sec might still pull 50 megabytes sec under this kind of heavy, random, small block workload. Still, that's 1/5 the throughput it claimed on the box. So the real measure of performance for a drive isn't throughput, it's IOPS, I/O operations per second. Unfortunately, IOPS ratings are difficult or impossible to find for consumer drives, and even with enterprise drives they're generally an exercise in liar pants on fire marketing. You're generally better off reading thorough reviews and testing from well-established, heavily technical sites than skimming a minimal list with nothing but numbers on it. Getting punished because you didn't allow enough RAM in your build for a healthy file system cache will hurt much less with a fast SSD than it will with a slow-spinning rust disk. But it will still hurt. The way games are designed, storage speed doesn't impact FPS at all. It can and will drastically affect zone load times, game save times, and so forth, and if you're unlucky, you can end up with a rendering latency spike if something in the game wants to read or write a block to disk while you're playing and has to wait. But that's where we leave the realm of raw FPS and start to talk about general performance. Remember, general performance isn't so much about making the fast things fast as it is about making the slow things less slow, mitigating or eliminating bottlenecks. Your storage is the single slowest part of the system, so it's crucial there. Storage is also crucial to multitasking, since its speed gets impacted more heavily when more processes are hitting it simultaneously. Goal impact base performance, multitasking, FPS, motherboard. Here's the thing about motherboards, they don't make your system go faster or slower. An Intel i7-7700 CPU won't be any faster in a $300 gaming motherboard than it is in a $40 budget board. If you're an overclocker, your motherboard can influence how fast the system runs in terms of how many options it gives you to tweak processor, bus, and RAM speed beyond design guidelines. But overclocking is usually better thought of as a hobby you enjoy than a practical way to make your system super fast. What you get in terms of extra speed tends to come at a cost of decreased reliability and overall system lifespan. The real-world performance differences tend to be much smaller than most people expect going into it, as well. Your choice of motherboard does determine how much RAM you can fit in the system, which CPUs you can use, and how many peripheral cards, including the GPU, you can install. Your choice of motherboard also influences your choice of case. You can put a small footprint mini ITX motherboard in a great big mid-tower case if you like, but you aren't going to cram a full-size ITX gamer's board intended to host multiple large GPUs into a cute little HD PC case. Motherboards are also crucial to your system's reliability and lifespan. A cheap board with no-name off-brand capacitors may be dead in 6 months, where a better constructed board with quality parts is still chugging along 10 years later. It's not generally sensible to base a build on a motherboard. Instead, you should pick the components you want, then find a motherboard to accommodate them. For that reason, despite its importance to the PC itself, I'm giving the motherboard a single star for all 3 design goals. Goal: impact, base performance, multitasking, FPS. Back when we built our own gaming rig, we had plenty of experience with the Corsair Obsidian 350D. Front intake fans, dual Corsair AF120 Quiet Edition installed within our chassis. Chassis, much like storage, mostly boils down to a fancy word for disk. Chassis boils down to a fancy word for case. The case you choose to put your components in doesn't have any direct impact on performance. Aside from a personal expression, your selection of chassis determines which motherboards will work for your build, how many disks you can cram in, how large a GPU you can use, and how well you can cool the resulting massive heat sources. Chassis come in several different form factors. You might decide on a tiny, small footprint desktop form factor, a middle-of-the-road mid-tower offering ease of access and good cooling without scaring off children and small pets, or even a horizontal rack mount beast with enough fan noise to drown out an airport. A well-designed case can make your life a lot easier if you expect to be frequently rebuilding or refining your rig. It can also make it possible to run the same rig a lot cooler and a lot quieter. For the most part, bigger chassis equals bigger and more fans possible equals running those fans at lower RPMs equals quieter build. Cooler builds also tend to be more reliable and live longer than hotter builds. Like the motherboard, the chassis won't make your build go faster, so I'm only giving it 1 star for each of our 3 design goals. But also, like the motherboard, it's still important even if it doesn't make stuff go fast. Choose wisely. Goal: impact, base performance, multitasking, FPS, power supply. Our final component, the power supply, aka PSU, is also critical to the build despite not making things go faster. You need a power supply that has enough oomph to power all your gear. A storage server with 6 hard drives in it needs more power than a standard PC, and a gaming system with a monster GeForce GTX 1080 needs even more than that. Your choice of power supply can also drastically affect how cool your rig runs and how noisy it is, since the PSU includes 1 or 2 of the biggest, most crucial fans in the system while generating a bunch of heat in its own right. And lastly, the PSU must fit in your case. A full-size ITX power supply won't do you any good in a mini ITX chassis requiring a Picapsu, and vice versa. You can geek out trying to figure out exactly how much power you'll need based on your individual components if you like, but it's usually simpler to go with a couple rules of thumb. You really don't need more than 350 W for a typical desktop system. For a storage system with multiple hard drives, 10 or less, 500 W or thereabouts will generally do the trick. A gaming system with a high-end GPU is the biggest hog, and that should probably be SPEC'd out with a PSU rated at least 750 W. A GTX 1080 Ti, for example, can draw 300 W all by its lonesome. If you undersupply your system, it will crash. It's generally better to play it safe than be sorry. Aside from the raw wattage rating, PSUs are frequently rated bronze, silver, gold, platinum, or even titanium, though so far no unobtainium rating is available, in terms of their power efficiency. This refers to how much more AC power they must draw from the wall in order to generate the DC power the system actually needs. A higher efficiency PSU will save you money directly by consuming less power. It will also generate less heat inside your case, extending the life of your build and potentially saving you even more money if you live in a warm climate and are more likely to be running the air conditioning than the central heat. Also, beware of suspiciously cheap off-brand PSUs. The market frequently sees a ton of fly-by-night short-lived imports carrying much higher ratings that don't reflect their actual ability to deliver clean power. Many consumer cases are offered with PSUs already installed. If you're buying a case from a well-known manufacturer, offered from a well-reviewed vendor, these are generally pretty safe bets for use at their stated ratings. Goal: impact, base performance, multitasking, FPS. Save it for next time. Give someone PC components, and they'll build for a weekend. Teach them how to think about PC components, and they'll be building for a lifetime. Whether from our routine system guide or another trusted tech source, there will never be any shortage of recommended parts floating around the internet. But too often, such exercises come with a presumed level of required knowledge and skip a desired level of explanation or thought process. The next time you come across folks debating AMD versus Ryzen or whether the next level up on anything from a GPU to a motherboard is worth it, hopefully you'll have a bit more practical perspective, or at least a reference bookmark to return to.